The lights of the Westwood Tower gleamed against the winter night, casting a silver glow over the glass walls. Inside, the top floor hummed with quiet tension, the kind that only came before a major decision. The boardroom was a cathedral of power, all marble tables and leather chairs, with a panoramic view of the city below. Eleanor Westwood stood at the head of the table, her tailored navy suit crisp under the recessed lights. At just 30 years old, she was a rare kind of CEO, poised, brilliant, and ruthlessly efficient. Every word she spoke landed like the click of a lock. Tonight, her eyes were fixed on a row of anxious executives as she tore apart a quarterly report that had fallen short of her standards. "Excellence," she said sharply, "isn't optional. Not here. If you can't keep up, you step aside for someone who can." From the far corner of the room, almost invisible, Daniel Cruz quietly adjusted the position of a mop bucket. The janitorial staff wasn't meant to be in here during meetings, but a last-minute call had summoned him upstairs to fix a spill in the hallway. Daniel kept his head down, moving like a shadow, hoping to finish before anyone noticed. But someone did notice. Eleanor's gaze flicked to him, not with warmth, but with the mild irritation of a person whose rhythm had been interrupted. "Could you handle that later?" she said, her voice edged with impatience. The words weren't cruel, but they carried the weight of dismissal. Her eyes moved back to the board without another thought. The executives laughed lightly, as though the janitor's presence were an amusing footnote in their important discussion. Daniel said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence was the safest shield. He pushed the mop toward the door, his back straight, but his stomach heavy with the quiet sting of being invisible in a room full of people who couldn't imagine his story. They didn't know he'd once been on the other side of a table like this. They didn't know that his hands, the same ones now gripping a mop, had once drawn up schematics for high-tech prototypes at a defense contractor. Or that a sudden loss, a chain of debts, and a little girl who needed him more than any career had pushed him into this life. By the time Daniel returned to the service elevator, the sound of Eleanor's voice still carried faintly through the corridor, steady, commanding, untouchable. He didn't know that in just a few hours, that same voice would be calling his name in panic. It started with a shudder. Just past 9 p.m. The tower trembled, the vibration traveling up through the floor like a deep groan from the earth itself. Daniel, on the lower maintenance level, froze mid-step. Seconds later, a muffled boom ripped through the building, followed by the distant wail of alarms. Sprinklers erupted overhead, misting the air with a cold spray as red lights strobed against the white walls. Emergency instructions blared from hidden speakers, urging occupants to evacuate immediately. Daniel's first thought was Lily safe at his neighbor's apartment, he hoped, and his second was training. Not janitorial training, but the emergency protocols he'd memorized years ago in engineering. He grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairwell. Above him, somewhere between the 45th and 46th floors, a woman's voice rang out sharp, desperate. "Help! Is anyone there?" Daniel stopped. He knew that voice. Eleanor Westwood was trapped. The beam of Daniel's flashlight cut through the swirling haze of sprinkler mist. Water streamed down the stairwell steps, carrying flecks of dust and fragments of ceiling tile. He started upward, each step slick beneath his boots, the alarm's shrill cry bouncing off the concrete walls. "Hello?" The voice came again, higher pitched this time, brittle with fear. Daniel rounded the corner to the 46th floor landing and froze. A jagged section of ceiling had collapsed, sealing off half the stairs with heavy slabs of concrete and twisted rebar. Wedged in the narrow gap between debris and wall, Eleanor Westwood clung to the railing, her normally composed face pale and streaked with dust. Her designer blazer was torn at the sleeve, the sharp edges of fabric damp from the sprinklers. She was gripping the metal rail so tightly her knuckles were white. When her eyes met Daniel's in the harsh beam of his flashlight, There was no trace of the confident CEO who had dismissed him earlier. "Cruz," she breathed, half in disbelief, half in relief. "The stairwell, it's—" She broke off as another distant rumble vibrated through the tower, sending a shower of plaster raining down around them. Daniel stepped forward, scanning the blockage. Years of dormant instincts kicked in, assessing angles, weights, the dangerous shift of the debris with each tremor. This wasn't the kind of mess you cleared with brute force. One wrong move and the whole section could collapse. "You're going to have to trust me," he said quietly. Eleanor blinked, as though unsure she'd heard him right. Trust. It was a word she rarely gave away, and never to people whose names she didn't bother remembering. But now, in this confined space, smelling faintly of smoke and wet cement, there was no boardroom. No title, just survival. He slid his flashlight between two pieces of rebar, illuminating a crawl space barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. "If I can shift some of this, you can get out, but you have to move fast when I say so." She hesitated, the unfamiliarity of taking orders, especially from him, tightening her jaw. "And if it collapses?" "Then we both hope we run faster than gravity," he said, his voice low but steady. Another tremor rippled through the building, forcing the decision for her. She nodded once. Daniel moved fast, pulling a pry bar from the emergency kit strapped to his belt. Each shift of the metal rods sent a groan through the debris. He felt the weight of it above him, the instability pressing down like a living thing. His shoulders ached, his boots slipped on the wet stairs. But little by little, the space widened. "Now," he barked. Eleanor dropped to her knees, crawling into the narrow gap. For one tense moment, her blazer snagged on a jagged edge, halting her movement. Daniel reached in, ripping the fabric free and pulling her toward him just as a beam overhead snapped with a sharp crack. They tumbled together onto the lower landing as the debris above crashed down, sealing the gap entirely. The sound was deafening, a single, final slam of stone and metal. For several seconds, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Eleanor sat back against the wall, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide. "You," she managed between breaths. "Shouldn't have risked that." Daniel stood, offering her a hand. "You'd have done the same," he said, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. As they moved down the slick stairs together, the building groaned again, this time accompanied by the smell of something acrid drifting upward. "Smoke." Eleanor glanced at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over, is it?" He shook his head. "Not even close." The smoke was faint at first, just a gray haze drifting up from the depths of the stairwell, but Daniel knew what it meant. Somewhere below, fire had found its footing. Heat would follow. "Stay close," he told Eleanor, his voice firm but calm. She didn't argue. The heels that once announced her arrival in every meeting now made her unsteady on the wet concrete steps, so she kicked them off without hesitation. Barefoot, she kept her grip on the railing, her breaths short and shallow. The sprinklers had drenched her hair, turning the sleek perfection of the CEO into something raw and human. The stairwell twisted downward floor by floor, but each landing brought new obstacles, chunks of plaster, twisted pipes spilling cold water, a railing bent inward like a broken rib. Daniel moved first, clearing the way, sometimes turning back to steady her with a hand under her elbow. At one landing, the ceiling sagged ominously, the metal frame buckling under the weight above. "We're not going under that," Daniel said, scanning for another route. He found a fire door, its glass cracked but still intact. The sign read 46B Mechanical Access. With a shoulder shove, the door gave way into a narrow service corridor. The air here was different, hotter, tinged with the coppery scent of exposed wiring. Somewhere in the distance, a pipe hissed like a cornered animal. Eleanor followed without complaint, though her eyes darted to every creak and echo. "How do you even know where we're going?" Daniel's flashlight beam cut over a faded building schematic mounted on the wall. "I read the plans when I first took this job," he said. "Old habit. You memorized them?" Her tone was a mix of surprise and reluctant respect. He didn't look at her. "I used to design places like this. It's not the kind of thing you unlearn." For a moment, silence filled the space between them, not the strained kind from the boardroom earlier, but something heavier. It lingered until the sound of splitting wood shattered it. They turned the corner just as a storage rack collapsed, sending a wave of equipment tumbling into their path. Daniel reacted instantly, yanking Eleanor back before a steel toolbox clattered to the ground inches from her feet. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the confined corridor. She exhaled shakily, her hand still gripping his arm. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Pulling me back from things I didn't even see coming." Daniel offered the faintest of smiles. "Maybe you're just not used to anyone watching your blind spots." They pressed on, the service corridor bending downward until it rejoined the main stairwell, this time at the 40th floor. The air here was thick with smoke, forcing both of them to cover their mouths with damp fabric. Somewhere below, the fire roared like a living beast, hungry and relentless. A distant crash echoed upward, followed by a sound Daniel recognized immediately, the groan of a failing support beam. His stomach tightened. "We need to move faster," he said, urgency sharpening his voice. "If that beam goes, this whole section could—" The rest of his sentence was drowned out by a deep, resonant crack. The stairwell shuddered violently, and a section of steps below them buckled, collapsing into the darkness. The only way down was now a jagged drop. Daniel crouched at the edge of the broken stairwell, his flashlight beam sweeping over the jagged gap. 2 full flights had given way, the twisted remains of concrete and steel dangling into the smoke-filled darkness below. The fall wasn't impossible, but in the chaos of a failing building, it might as well have been a cliff. Eleanor stood just behind him, coughing into the sleeve of her damp blazer. That's at least 15 feet. More like 12. Daniel corrected, scanning for anchor points. "We can make it. But you'll need to trust me again." Her laugh was sharp and short, not mocking, just incredulous. "You keep saying that as if I've got a better option." He swung his backpack around, pulling free a length of coiled rope, frayed but still strong. "Old maintenance gear," he explained. "Not ideal, but it'll hold." The air was hotter here, the smoke thicker, creeping into his lungs. Somewhere far below, a metallic clang rang out, followed by the dull roar of fire finding more fuel. The tower was bleeding heat and strength, and Daniel could feel time pressing down on them. He tied a quick knot around a railing support beam, testing the rope with his full weight before turning to her. "You go first, I'll be right behind." She hesitated, her hand on the rope, looking at him in the flashing red light. For a moment, she seemed less like the woman who could slice through an entire board with a single sentence, and more like someone staring down something she couldn't control. "Daniel." Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the alarms. "Why are you even here? Why risk this for me?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because walking away would mean Lily grows up thinking her father didn't try." Her eyes flickered confusion, then something warmer, though the heat of the stairwell made it hard to name. She nodded once and began her descent. Halfway down, the rope swayed as debris crashed somewhere nearby. She froze. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Daniel cut in, his voice steady despite the tremor in the building. "Keep moving, you're almost there." She gritted her teeth and slid the rest of the way, landing on the lower landing with a thud. Looking up, she held the rope taut for him. "Your turn." Daniel started down, the rope biting into his palms. He was halfway when another deep, shuddering groan rippled through the stairwell. The beam above them shifted with a screech of metal, the kind of sound that said it wouldn't hold much longer. "Daniel, hurry." He dropped the last few feet, hitting the landing hard. As soon as his boots touched down, the rope above snapped free, the whole section falling away into darkness. They didn't speak for a moment, just stood there, their breathing loud in the smoky air. Eleanor finally broke the silence. "You were right." "About what?" "That rope wasn't ideal." A faint smile tugged at his mouth despite the tension. But the moment was short-lived. Through the smoke below, a faint, flickering orange glow was growing brighter. The fire was no longer distant. It was coming for them. Daniel took her hand not as a rescuer guiding someone through danger, but as a man making sure they both stayed alive. "We've got to move. Now." The lower they went, the heavier the air became thick with smoke, heat pressing against their skin like a physical weight. Daniel led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through a haze that blurred the edges of everything. The alarms were still screaming, but beneath them was another sound, the deep, rolling roar of fire alive and feeding. They reached the 35th floor landing, only to find the stairwell blocked again, this time by a wall of twisted metal and burning debris. The heat was so intense that Eleanor instinctively stepped back, her arm shielding her face. "There's no way through that," she said, coughing. Daniel scanned their surroundings, eyes catching on a maintenance hatch just above head height. "There's another way, but it's not pretty." He boosted himself up, pried it open, and dropped back down. "It's a service duct. Narrow, hot, and not built for comfort, but it runs parallel to the main stairwell." Eleanor hesitated, glancing at the small, dark opening. "How narrow?" Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. "You'll have to crawl, and it's going to be hot as hell in there." She let out a slow breath, then nodded. "Lead the way." Inside, the duct was a tight metal tunnel that rattled with every distant explosion in the building's bones. The metal was warm to the touch, and sweat immediately began beading on their skin. Eleanor followed Daniel on her hands and knees, the sound of her labored breathing echoing in the confined space. At one point, the duct narrowed even more, forcing them to squeeze through single file. Daniel glanced back, his voice low and steady. "Almost there. Keep your weight centered. Don't rush." She gave a dry laugh despite the situation. "You're surprisingly good at talking people through things." "So, it's easier when the stakes are clear," he said, "when you've got someone you can't afford to lose." Something in his tone made her pause, even as the heat pressed against them. "You mean Lily?" He nodded. "She's all I've got left. Lost my wife 3 years ago. Car accident. I walked away without a scratch, but she—" His voice trailed off, and for a moment the sound of the fire below filled the space between them. Eleanor didn't know why she whispered, but she did. "I'm sorry." They crawled on in silence after that. But something had shifted. The air between them felt different, even in the choking heat. When they finally dropped down from the duct into another stairwell section, the air was cooler, but the building's structure was groaning louder now, like a wounded animal. Dust drifted from the ceiling with every shudder. Eleanor leaned against the wall, catching her breath. "You shouldn't still be here," she said. "You could have gotten out hours ago." Daniel looked at her, his face streaked with soot, eyes sharp and steady. "Maybe I didn't want to." Before she could answer, a deafening crack split the air and the floor beneath them tilted, pitching them both toward the railing. Daniel grabbed her, pulling her back just as a section of stairs tore away into the smoke below. They were running out of building. And time. The building was no longer groaning, it was screaming. Every shudder of the walls felt like a countdown, every falling fragment of concrete a warning. Daniel's hand was still gripping Eleanor's as he scanned the broken stairwell. Only one way down remained a final flight leading to the lobby level. But halfway there, the steps were partially collapsed, the gap wide enough that a fall could mean broken bones, or worse. Through the haze, Daniel spotted flickers of daylight near the bottom. Not sunlight, emergency floodlights from rescue crews outside. They were close. "Think you can jump it?" he asked. Eleanor swallowed, her eyes locked on the gap. "If you can." Daniel moved first, testing the stability of the steps before taking the leap. His boots hit the far side with a jolt that rattled up his legs. He turned immediately, holding his arms out. "Come on." She backed up, took a breath, and ran. For a second, she was airborne, suspended in the flashing red light. Then she slammed into his arms, almost knocking them both down. He caught her, their momentum carrying them forward until they crashed into the far wall. Neither moved for a heartbeat. His chest rose and fell against hers, their faces inches apart. The roar of fire and the pounding of their hearts drowning out everything else. Then he stepped back. "Let's go." The lobby was chaos, shattered glass, overturned furniture, water pouring from broken sprinklers. Heat rolled in waves from a section of wall where flames licked at the edges of a broken window frame. Rescue crews in heavy gear were shouting, guiding survivors toward the exits. They broke into a run, weaving through debris. The air was clearer near the front doors, and the cold blast of night hit them like a blessing. Outside, flashing lights painted the street in red and blue. Eleanor doubled over, coughing hard, her bare feet pressed against the cold pavement. Daniel stayed beside her until she could straighten, his hand still hovering at her back like he wasn't ready to let go. An EMT rushed toward them, checking Eleanor's pulse. "You're lucky," the medic said, shaking his head. A few more minutes and… He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the burning tower. The woman who had started her night in that boardroom felt a million miles away from the one standing here now. "You didn't just save me," she said softly, turning to Daniel. "You stayed when you didn't have to." He shrugged, though his eyes stayed locked on hers. Sometimes, the right thing costs you. Sometimes it's worth it. For a moment, the world around them faded, the sirens, the shouting, the chaos. All that remained was the weight of what they'd just survived together. A firefighter called Daniel over to answer questions, but before he turned, Eleanor caught his hand. "Daniel, I won't forget this. I won't forget you." His grip tightened briefly before he stepped away, disappearing into the crowd of responders. Eleanor stood there, the night air biting at her skin, her heart pounding with something she couldn't yet name. She'd walked into that tower as the woman who thought she had everything: power, control, certainty. She was walking away knowing she'd just met someone who could change all of it. And somewhere deep down, beneath the adrenaline and exhaustion, she knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the first chapter.